So Joe, great to have you. Thank you for leading our discussion. And enjoy.
Thanks, Ben. Actually, when Ed and I were talking yesterday, we both pondered what Paddy would have been saying and doing right now as we look at the horrors that are unfolding in Ukraine. And I think that's where we have to start today. Although Ed's book is about the future of liberal democracy in Britain, it is perhaps timely to think about it as something more global. And I'm going to start oddly by quoting William Hague, former Conservative Foreign Secretary, who in Monday's Times wrote, "In the impressive leadership of President Zelensky and the bravery of Ukrainians defending their country, we're able to find an inspiration not felt for many years. It is the moral advantage that lies with an open society and functioning democracy." You could have written that, couldn't you, Ed Davey?
Yeah, I could have done. And we are in a battle for the liberal world. This terrible, terrible wake-up call that is Putin's aggression against Ukraine should really reverberate across capitals. We've seen over years a rise of nationalism and populism, and democracies being sort of relegated. We really have got to rediscover the liberal order that so many people over decades built up around our world, and whether it's strengthening NATO, and hasn't that happened quickly in the last few days, whether it's coming together to help the refugees who are going through such a catastrophe and the human misery which is almost unfathomable, to things like energy, how we power our world to make sure we bring together energy security and climate change. So this is a wake-up call for liberals across the world, and President Zelensky is actually a liberal, and we should get behind him anyway. But I feel his leadership actually for that new liberal order.
You said it's a wake-up call, Ed, to the world order, the changing world order, and the changing dynamics. Robert Peston, writing in The Spectator today, argues that this is the death, or it marks the death of globalization. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't actually. I think he's taken the wrong conclusion. If you've seen from the actions with European colleagues and colleagues across the world, they want to see an organization like NATO stronger. They want to commit more resources to it. I also think when we look at beyond Russia, look at China, I hope that we will take the right conclusions with respect to China, which isn't that we pull apart the world trading order, but that we recognize more that the tensions. I remember going to Geneva for the Doha round of the World Trade Organization, and hearing from Pascal Lamy, who was then Director General of the WTO, how the clash between the US and China was getting in the way of improvements in things like free trade. And I think we're only going to restore that order which was pushing towards greater freedom, greater democracy, and greater prosperity if we learn the lessons, not to reinvent the globalization that we've seen in the last sort of 30, 40 years, but bring some liberal insights to that, recognize where it went wrong, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
This is very much, I would imagine, from the prism of the White House. This is very much a European war. And obviously the repercussions are going to be felt around the world, but it is very much within the continent of Europe, I suppose. And we've seen, Georgia now asking to join the EU, Sweden as well, and all that comes into. And I don't want to go back down over the old Brexit vote referendum and whether we should rejoin or whatever. But it is, in some ways, it is reshaping the dynamics between Europe as a continent and the rest of the world. I wonder what you feel, Ed, about the way the government, the British government, has responded to Ukraine. Do you think they've been quick enough? Do you think we're doing enough?
Well, some things they've done right. I think we've seen in Ben Wallace some leadership on the need for military aid to the Ukraine, but in other areas, I think they've been slow and even woeful. I think our response to the refugee crisis in particular has been appalling. And this is, I couldn't think of a worse time to have a Home Secretary like Priti Patel. You know, we should be generous and open. And European colleagues have frankly put the UK to shame in the way that they have opened their arms and made sure that the now million Ukrainian refugees can be given a proper welcome, and paperwork will not, and bureaucracy will not get in the way of a generous offer. And I do have to come back to the way that the Conservative government, frankly, for years now, has turned a blind eye to the way that Putin's cronies have been able to come to London and this country, buy up assets, be they property, be they companies, and launder their dirty money. Liberal Democrats have long argued that we needed to have transparency, and we needed to hold people to account. When I was Secretary of State of Energy and Climate Change, without much help from the Tories, I might say, I prevented Mikhail Friedman, a close Putin crony, from getting his hands on 7% of the oil and gas production from the North Sea. So I've been aware of this problem for some time, and I think the government might have been aware of it. They've done very little about it, and even their measures to date, as we speak, are frankly nowhere near strong enough.
No, well, you know, we do have a former mayor of London who loved to parade the fact and boast about the fact that London had become Londongrad, with Russian oligarchs coming here and buying up property. But let us move on. You write in the book, Ed, liberalism has always been an anti-establishment, reformist, forward-looking creed aimed at improving people's lives by challenging the status quo and appealing to people's dreams. How can you regain that anti-establishment mantle when it has been so tarnished by populists and nationalists around the world?
Oh, I think by offering them a liberal anti-establishment. I mean, the way that we want to get a fair deal for people, whether it's in schools or health service or in housing and so on, which we talk about in many chapters in the book, and effectively rebuild that social contract that was there. That is an anti-establishment message. We are the ones who've always said that the power settlements in the United Kingdom are just not good enough, whether it's the political sphere, the economic sphere, the social sphere, and we're the ones challenging the status quo. So I think our role as an anti-establishment reformist party is as strong as ever. What I think we failed to do is to communicate that as well as we might. And one of the ideas behind the Battle for Liberal Britain is to start a much better way of talking to people about the issues that affect their lives and make liberalism relevant to their lives, show people there is a different way, and try and rebuild their trust in politics.
And that is probably the nub, and it's not particular to the Liberal Democrats, the Tories, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Labour Party. Every political party knows, from knocking on the door or from your postbag as an MP or as a councillor, that many, many people across the country feel completely powerless. They feel as though their voices aren't heard, their votes don't count, and they've heard whoever it is, who, you know, this is not a party specific thing, but whoever promises to listen, to engage, so rarely does. So why would anybody believe the Liberal Democrats are any better at it than anybody else?
Well, I think there are two ways I'd answer that. First of all, our record at local government doing community politics, where community politics, the essence of it is that you listen to the community, listen to the people who you live with, who you seek to represent, and then take on their issues. And I feel the party, in a way, not at necessarily local government level, but at national government, has failed to do that in recent years. And we've got to do a much better job building on our amazing record at local government, where we have embodied that listening. And I think you saw some of that at the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, where, you know, we took our ideas and we listened to people and they wanted to talk about planning. It wasn't us, they wanted to talk about planning. And similarly in North Shropshire, the issues from the voters was ambulance waiting times. Who'd have thought that? But we really listened to people and then we responded to that. I'd actually bring in electoral reform here, because if you're about giving people more power, which Liberal Democrats are, and ensuring the political system holds the powerful to account, electoral reform is key to unlocking that. And I think if you have that sort of deep political reform, you can deal with a lot of this unhappiness with politics, which we have seen, and it's been getting worse. And I sense the appetite for more radical political reform, which Liberal Democrats have been the champions of. I think it's greater now than it's been for some time.
We did an event, actually it was Piers's Politica event we did a few months ago now as a Radix Big Tent conversation like this about electoral reform. I mean, one of the questions that has to be asked is the referendum at the start of the Lib Dem Conservative coalition. Was it too soon to ask people? Because it certainly didn't indicate public. So this is a two-part question. Was it too soon to ask people? And do you think people would have changed their minds if they were asked that again?
Well, it was certainly too soon in that government, but also it wasn't on proportional representation. It was a flawed form of electoral reform, and many people in the party, including myself, were sort of caught in that dilemma, if you like, and there were many people who didn't vote for it because it wasn't the electoral reform that they wanted. And I think things have moved on since then. There's no doubt about that. This appetite for political reform I was just talking about, I think, is something that we can harness. And I think there's points about giving voters more power by making their vote more powerful. Make votes matter, to talk about the campaigning organization, is the way you can restore trust. And that wasn't on offer before. It would be on offer with our policies.
Do you think, Ed, that COVID, in a sense, brought communities together in a way that no political organization could have managed because it just happened organically? We saw, and in fact, I'm sure Ben will type up a note reminding people of the fantastic book that we put together of people's various experiences and how they sort of rose to the challenge of dealing in their local communities and dealing very directly with each other, sometimes with and sometimes without the support of local councils or other bodies. Do you think that COVID has changed the way people think about how they can use their power, if you like, and how that now fits in? I mean, I suppose what I'm asking is, are we now looking at a better understanding of community politics in its truest sense that was always, certainly in my time at Westminster, was always slightly sneered at?
Well, there's certainly an element of that. There's no doubt that people did feel that they could take power and help their neighbour, they could help the more vulnerable people in their community, and they rose to that challenge. And they did so in vast numbers. And that did, without doubt, show a community spirit that we hadn't seen for many a long year. I guess the question, the challenge for the party, for the country, is how do we capture that and nurture it and take it forward? And I would argue you're only going to do that if you have a stronger local government and you have a community politics which can enable that to happen. So, I feel our political system does shut people out, not just because of the voting system, but because of the centralisation of power in our country. And if liberals are nothing if we're not about giving people more power, and that includes devolution, decentralisation, to enable communities to have that real power. Because part of the barrier to fostering that spirit of community that's come through in the pandemic, part of the barrier is the power barrier. And I saw this in talking to local people in my constituency. They were wanting to do things, and then they came up against barriers to do it. And it could have been regulations, it could have been lack of budgets, it could have been the ability to bring people together in the statutory agencies. And I like to think in my community we sort of overcome that. We had a Better Together campaign in Kingston, which brought everyone together. It was fantastic. But to make sure that has longevity, I think we've got to get some of these barriers down. We've got to enable more participative democracy, more deliberative democracy, where people can get involved in the decisions, and it's not just at election time that they're asked their opinion and have a real role, but between elections too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because you're very keen on deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies, and I know that you've got some examples of where that is proven really, really successfully in Canada and Iceland. I mean, it's not uncommon in this country, and there are some excellent examples. And again, this is something we touched on the levelling up discussion a couple of weeks ago. But deliberative democracy, for people who are not familiar with the term, how would you define it?
Well, there's different versions of it. I mean, one probably the most common that people probably have heard of in the United Kingdom is citizens' assemblies. And we've seen in the debate around climate change how in local areas people are coming together to think about how their area is going to deal with the challenges of climate change and how it can respond to it. So there's a really classic example that is happening across the UK already. But if you look around the world, there's some really rich and deep versions of that, sometimes involving budgets. There are examples of what's called participative budget making, where people are given the options and the choices, where would they prefer the money to be spent. A classic example, and it shows the importance of rebuilding people's trust in democracy and the link with community politics, was from Iceland. And if you remember, in the financial crash, Iceland had a particularly bad time with the Icelandic banks, and there was a real feeling in Iceland of the democracy had gone wrong, had lost its way, and needed to be rebuilt. And one of the solutions they adopted was to use technology to engage people more in decision making. And Reykjavik City Council, not something you've heard probably referred to before, produced this online platform which gave people the chance to put forward ideas, what they wanted to see in their street, in their neighborhood, in their parks, in their town. And those ideas were voted on by local people. And the citizen-led idea generation and decision-making then forced the council was open to it, to then take forward ideas. And during just a decade of this, over 80% of citizens in Reykjavik got engaged at least once, and nearly 700 projects started by this process actually were implemented. Now, I don't think that's ever happened in the UK at that level. And so the reason I give that example is, in one city, which isn't a huge city after all, they managed to involve huge numbers of the residents in actually making decisions. And that's not something that's often talked about in British politics. But if you really want to rebuild democracy and rebuild people's trust, that is a model we should be looking at much more closely.
Ellie Costello has put a point here which says citizens' assemblies in any form must be accessible. All too often it's the most vocal, most mobile who are able to attend and engage. How do we ensure inclusivity, representation and agency is given to all regardless of age, ethnicity, culture, gender, etc.? And I think Sarah Castell, I hope I've got that right, Sarah, would love to hear your views, Ed, on what you perceive the barriers to be to greater deliberative democratic innovations. Why don't decision makers go for them? And what do we in this sector do to evidence the benefits and overcome the barriers? And Simon McGrath is really taking up Ellie's point as well. Citizens' assemblies are fundamentally undemocratic, favour the educated and articulate. And as Tom Brake, your former colleague, points out here, formally constituted citizens' assemblies are chosen to be fully representative. So there's a whole view on this, and there is always this feeling that it's the well-connected, the well-off, the people who've got the time and the ability to get involved in these things who are going to have their voice heard. I just want to remind you, if you wonder why I'm reading out things and not looking at it, it's because people are putting things on the chat forms, which we welcome you to do, and I'll get to as many people as I possibly can. So Ed, to you, so how do we make sure that citizens' assemblies and any sort of local deliberative democracy does not favour the squeaky wheels?
Well, I'm with Tom Brake on this, both as experience as an MP and now involved in Unlock Democracy. Tom, I'm sure, will be able to speak more eloquently about this than I can, but listen, there's really a lot of learning about how you do good citizens' assemblies. Of course, they can go wrong. Of course, you could get a skewed group of people together, but there's a lot of learning about how you avoid that. There's lots of best practice to make sure you are truly representing the local community. And that's important, because I think we all know that sometimes you can get people to council meetings who are deeply unrepresentative of the wider community, and you've got to make sure that you are building those best practices in. But listen, you know, the key thing I think is not one model. Actually, when I look around the world, I see very different ways of how you help people become more active citizens. There was a mayor of Calgary, the first Muslim mayor in North America, who came up with a brilliant idea, and he called it the lesson of three. And what he said to people was, tell me 3 things you want to do for Calgary, what you want to do for Calgary, a bit President Kennedy-like, and I'm going to help you do those things. So it was sort of invitation to every citizen to come forward with ideas to see if the city mayor could make them happen. And what I would say, he got in with a small majority to begin with. He got over 70% of the vote when he implemented this idea. So, you know, as a good liberal, there's not one size fits all. But I think saying that the only way of engaging the community is through local government councils and local democracy, great though that is, and a huge supporter of it though I am, I think that is quite a narrow version. You know, in Kingston, we experimented with the council having neighbourhood committees that were in the local areas, that people could come and be more engaged. That was quite successful, but in and of itself, it didn't go far enough. So what I'm saying is, and you'll see this in Jane Dodd's chapter in the book, for example, there are ways that we can do community politics in a deeper way, which I think gives it more power and will tackle the sorts of problems, the feeling of powerlessness, the feeling of being taken for granted. I think there are ways we can do that.
Well, I'm not sure whether you'll have convinced Joe Zammit-Lucia, who says, have we therefore lost faith in the concept of representative democracy, which is supposed to entrust elected representatives with diving into issues that are usually highly complex and difficult and make decisions on behalf of citizens? Is deliberative democracy not a different route to populism? Simon McGrath.
No. Let me take that straight on, because I still fundamentally believe in representative democracy. Okay, one of the reasons why I think you can have that link to other forms that are partnering it, like deliberative democracy, is because I think it does avoid the problem of populism. If you have direct democracy and, you know, government by referenda, I think you do have real problems, because you don't have a considered process that can ensure that all the different arguments are put together in as neutral but as factual way as possible, and the people who are involved in it can ask decisions. That's why representative democracy has to be the cornerstone. I fundamentally believe in that as someone who's been elected to Parliament. But I think it would be surely a little bit old-fashioned to think we can't improve on that and engage the public far more than we have. So I hope that reassures Joe. I don't know if it does. I don't want to go to a direct democracy model. I think that has huge flaws in it, for all the reasons I think that are well rehearsed. But I do think you can engage people more and give them the information so they are able to participate in that decision-making process.
One of the areas, and I should point out that you didn't write this book all by yourself, Ed. You've actually edited it. So the chapters and the different topics are from a wide range of views and voices. It's not the Ed Davey monologue. But one of the areas where obviously the Liberal Democrats have got I don't know why, but you know, have always held very firm views and been ahead of the field in some ways in education. And there are some proposals in there on sort of COVID catch-up and the way that parents can be more involved in schools. You also say, or in the book it says, I'm increasingly attracted to a world where we set education free from Whitehall controls, which, you know, does sound to some people as though that's more free schools and academies.
Oh no, don't misread it. I mean, let's first of all start on my overall approach to education, and that is to, absolutely fund it far better than we have, particularly with schemes like the pupil premium to ensure we're supporting the disadvantaged pupils, to make sure we build on that great liberal democratic success and promote social mobility. That's obviously a core to it. But I think if, I took two lessons away from my experience as a parent trying to teach my 7-year-old daughter maths during the pandemic. First of all, I huge respect for teachers. I wasn't a very successful teacher of my daughter. So, I do think we should invest in professional teaching. But it absolutely did bring me closer to her learning experience because I was engaged, my wife was engaged in it far more than we would otherwise have been. And I think if you then broaden that and look at some of the research that's been done, and also think about where we take education to the next level, I think engaging and involving parents far more is absolutely where we should be at. And that's, I think, a truly liberal approach, empowering parents. And when we were thinking about this, we dusted down an old idea of vouchers, but gave it, I think, a much more modern relevance. Because the old idea of vouchers, which was debated in the 50s and 60s and 70s, was all about, going to different schools. And it's almost like a false choice, which isn't deliverable. Our approach to vouchers was in a way more minimalistic, but in a way richer. So what we were saying as part of COVID catch up, yes, give money to the schools with no strings attached in the way that central government was doing and did do it, but also give some money to parents in terms of vouchers, which they could spend at their school, or they could choose to spend in the community, and with a real focus on extracurricular activities like music and art and sport and so on, and not just on academic subjects. And I think that is the approach to catch up, engaging the parents, making sure the child's education is much more wider than sometimes some state schools are able to provide on current finance, and ensuring that the education is seen in a wider context and thinks about the well-being of the child, the mental health of the child. So I'm quite excited by this notion of parental vouchers, getting them engaged far more, to be part of the decision making about the things that their child is learning and doing.
I don't know if you've got a chance, Ed, to see the chat, but it's running like ticker tape, which is brilliant because this is
I can't see it, I'm afraid.
Oh, can't you? Oh, well, it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, this is what Radix Big Tent is all about. It's about these conversations. I think we've got our own citizens' assembly going on here, but I mean, it's on everything from deliberative democracy to education. I want to...
can I assure you, Ed, we're going to be sharing that chat with you. So do everybody keep contributing to it. We will.
I was just about to say that, actually, Ben. Thank you. Please share it.
No, it's absolutely fantastic, and it's why these events are such a joy. But I just want to move slightly away from education to a question from Ashok Gupta, who is asking, if we want local bodies to have proper accountability, does this imply transferring tax-raising powers from central government to local government?
Well, ultimately, yes. Obviously, it's how that is done needs lots of careful study. But if you look at the UK and compare us to almost every other Western democracy, we are the most centralized in the way finance is raised and spent. And I think that's fundamental to what Liberal Democrats are about. I remember Paddy Ashdown once saying, maybe you wrote it, Joe, I don't know. He said where we were the only party that when we got into power, we wanted to give it away. And that, I think, is a definition of liberalism. We want to push power down, and power so much in politics, as we all know, is about money. And if money is just raised centrally, then you're not giving power away, are you? So there are many ways that can be done, but we need to look at the best practice elsewhere, and that has to be the long-term aim.
Okay, let us talk a little about climate change, which is obviously a subject very close to your heart, Ed, because of your experience in government. You would like to see a department for net zero with bigger responsibilities than DEC enjoyed, which would include transport and the built environment. I mean, it's hard to see that one floating given the cost of living crisis that we're facing at the moment and the growing clamour of the anti-climate change, the anti-climate change lobby, the anti-net zero green energy lobby, who do seem to have a very loud voice because they're saying it's too expensive, we can't do it now. You've got a lot of proposals in this book, The Battle for Liberal Britain, about how to deal with climate change. So a department for net zero is fine. How would that work in joined up government?
Well, first of all, I mean, having been Secretary of State for DEC for 3 years, it was really clear that when you had a cabinet minister focused on the objective, you could get more done. And if net zero is as important as I believe it is, and the Tories say they think it is, then you need a cabinet minister to push that forward every day and every week. So institutional change is not something I sort of think is the panacea, but having been there in government and then seen what DEC could do, and now how Bayes is failing to deliver on the green agenda, I'm absolutely clear that is a critical part of the leadership that's going to be needed in the future. But you've got my heckles going, Joe, because that yes, the right-wing climate deniers or climate delayers try to make out that green is more expensive. Nonsense, absolute and utter nonsense, and we've proven it. When I was reforming the electricity market and bringing in things like contracts for difference and auctions and so on, I was lambasted by the right wing about how expensive it was going to be. Well, actually, green power, offshore wind, solar, onshore wind, is cheaper than fossil fuel generated electricity by a significant margin. We've brought it down dramatically in price, and now we're the world leader in offshore wind. Now, it is absolutely clear that green is cheap, and given what's happening with Russia, surely people can see not just the link between the climate change agenda, but the energy security agenda. If we want to make sure we are independent for energy, what better way than renewables? So we used to discuss what we call the trilemma when I was Secretary for Energy. Which was price.
I'm borrowing you to check how.
I think someone needs to be on mute there. The trilemma, which was price, climate change, and energy security. And people used to say there was a tension in going green. I never thought that, and now the evidence absolutely backs me up. If you want to be more secure, if you want to go green, and if you want to cut heating bills, going green in the way that we propose is the way to do it. So massive investment in renewables, building on what Liberal Democrats achieved, and massive insulation programs. I'm actually quite excited about taking that on with the Tories, because they've been proven wrong time and time again. And one was worried a little bit, well, politically worried, that the Tories had sort of closed down the debate on climate change and had just sort of taken over the mantle. It's increasingly clear with the Steve Bakers of this world and others, the Tories are really divided on this. So, it means that Liberal Democrats can go on the doorstep of the next election and be proud of our record, proud of our policies, and say, if you really want action, you cannot afford to vote Conservatives. The Conservative Party does not know what it thinks about this critical issue of our generation.
Okay, well, we'll come on to electioneering in a minute, but I still want to say on this, because one of the arguments in the book is to hit the city, to change the rules of capital markets in a way, so that the trillions of pounds required to switch out fossil fuels and carbon-intensive industries into green, then that could be regulated or encouraged by the City of London. Do you see that working?
Oh, absolutely. It became clear to me that there was a real danger if we allowed so much money going into the old economy, into the dirty economy, that pensioners of tomorrow are going to lose all their savings. There's something called the carbon bubble, and what that essentially means is that there's too much money going to oil and gas and coal, and we've already found 4 or 5 times the amount of fossil fuels that we could possibly burn and stay within 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees of global warming. And when the world eventually realizes that, which I think will be probably just a few years away, if you've overinvested in the dirty stuff, that bubble will burst and people's savings will be wrecked. And it's become an issue of financial stability for the City of London and financial markets around the world. And that's why people like Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, not a soft touch, he's led a lot of the work on this. I'd actually go further than Mark Carney, but what he's done in the debate around the need for transparency of disclosure of companies and financial institutions with respect to their carbon investments is already having an impact in the way that I talk about the book, and I would like to go further, because I think climate risk is now a risk that every investor, shareholder, pensioner has to take seriously. And the rules of many of the financial markets don't require that sufficiently. And that's imprudent. It's not prudent regulation. So here's a case, yet again, where the welfare and prosperity of our country going forward actually is completely interlinked with action on climate change. And it's irresponsible, dangerously, fiscally irresponsible conservatives who haven't woken up to that.
Joe Zamet-Lucia makes a point and says, how do we embed these issues, the climate change issues, as critical to every department, not just an environment or net zero department, which in a way brings us on to the next point, which is planning, because all the time we're building homes, 350,000 new homes a year needed in England alone. How do you square that with net zero? How do you square poor public transport, which requires people to use cars to get to work and to school and to college and things? How do you square that with, everything that I suppose is to a large extent in the levelling up agenda?
Well, first thing, I think two big ways you do it. The first is through regulations to make sure that every new home is built to the highest possible standard. And we tried to do that. We introduced something called zero carbon homes. It was a Liberal Democrat initiative in the coalition. It went into law and would have meant that every home built in the future would have already been net zero ready. What did the Tories do? 2 months after the 2015 election, when they were left on their own, they scrapped that regulation. The fact that they get 25% of their funding from developers may have had something to do with that. I couldn't possibly comment. But you do need those tough regulations to get that progress. And actually, I spoke to people who were developers, members of something called the Green Building Alliance, and they were very keen for our proposal. So there's actually a minority of developers who are against the sorts of things I'm talking about. And if we had done that, there'd be a lot of people whose heating bills would be lower if that regulation had stayed in place. But it's not just about regulations and clever, smart regulations. I believe the Zero Carbon Homes one was, because it was regulating the outcome, not the input. That's why it was a smart regulation. It's also how you do planning reform. So this is quite close to my heart, because we won the Cheshire and Amersham by-election listening to people who were worried about the Conservatives' planning reforms and then giving our own alternative. If you remember, the Conservatives wanted to centralise planning and also give lots of power to developers, a developer-led planning system, muting the voice of local communities. And people in Cheshire and Amersham didn't like it. And the Tories said it's the only way to build the homes. Absolute nonsense. Our alternative to developer-led planning system is a community-led planning system, and that's the evidence is that really does work very, very well. It comes from two of my Liberal Democrat past colleagues, Andrew Stunnell and Don Foster. When they had responsibility for this, they introduced laws to allow neighbourhood planning. So it's not a requirement, but it's an option for communities, and some communities in their local neighbourhoods have taken that power that Liberal Democrats gave them, and they produced neighbourhood plans. There's about 800 across the country, and the main study of how that's impacted on all the issues we're talking about shows that not only did it increase housing supply against what the developers said it would do, it's actually increased house building, it's actually resulted in better designed homes meeting the needs of their communities more, so more affordable housing, housing meeting higher environmental standards, with also the community facilities that communities need, which developers often forget about. So there's a classic example of Liberal Democrat philosophy in action, delivering on the homes we need, but doing it in a way which meets both societal needs and environmental needs. I'm really proud of my colleagues Andrew Stunnell and Don Foster. I don't think I've ever told them that. I should do next time I see them.
I'm sure they're listening in. We've only got about 15 minutes left, so I want to try and cover as much ground as we possibly can. Tom Brake has put a note up saying, as we speak, Putin is shutting down the last remaining independent media outlets in Russia and arresting our sister party members, which sort of ties into a question from Robert Shaw. Ed, please can you say something about your approach to big tech, and in particular the Liberal Democrat approach to, for example, the echo chamber effects of social media? I mean, very timely at the moment.
Well, there's 2 chapters or 3 chapters in this book which talk about technology policy, and you know, I hope this will be a way of developing ideas in the party. You know, I think we do need to take some of the challenges of social media much more seriously than we have. I'd actually focus on mental health issues of children and young people, which I think have not been dealt with anywhere near enough. I think we do need to look at how they can impact our democracy. I think we do need to look at making sure that they're not creating unfair competition with other businesses. So there are definite issues there. What I wouldn't want to do is be ultimately negative about technology. Technology isn't some neutral development in our society, never has been, and it's up to politicians to shape that. And whether you're shaping that through tax legislation, through competition legislation, or other lawmaking, you've got to politicians have got to get as ahead of the curve as they can and set the parameters in which the businesses will operate. And I do think we've got to work with other countries far more than we've been doing on this area. So I think the liberal values and ideas that are in this book that we're known for apply to social media can come up with many of the solutions. And you know, I'm sure Nick Clegg would agree with me.
And the very specific question from Aman Shigaoka, sorry, Aman, do you see the proposal of the Digital Markets Unit, the new CMA regulator, gifted new powers, as a good step in the direction of the tech industry?
So I'm going to be honest, I haven't studied that proposal in any detail. I do think that the CMA, which I was involved in setting up, needs to take digital issues extremely seriously, whether it's making sure, as I said earlier, that there's not unfair competition, but also in holding some of these really big companies properly to account. Chris Gasson in this book talks about some radical ideas about how you might do that, which I think would probably go further than a unit in the DCMS. I remember when I was competition minister being deeply troubled about Google, having met a small company who had got a much better search engine than Google and who'd effectively been shut down by Google. You know, there was a marketplace where the state wasn't able to implement what I would call free and fair competition policy. So the technology does throw up some real challenges. Whether this unit's up to it, I don't know. One of the reasons why I think you need some aspect of international competition policy, which of course we had in the European Union, is because some of these tech companies, they pick off individual countries. And there is strength in numbers when you're dealing with a Microsoft or a Google or Apple or an Amazon. And you know, I'm not saying these companies are producing bad things. They're producing lots of things that people like, and they're very popular. Let's be clear about it. But we still need to make sure that they are properly regulated, and that if competition can come to the aid of the citizen, then let's go for that.
Ed, throughout the book, there is a lot of criticism of the Conservative Party, understandably, because they've been in power for 12 years. But I'm going to ask you the question that used to plague my life when I was working for Paddy Ashdown. Where do you sit with Labour? What's your relationship like with Labour under Keir Starmer?
Well, first of all, just very briefly on the Conservatives, I make no apology for having a good criticism of them, not just because they've been in power, but I fought the Conservatives all my life, and a lot of the problems I see, that whether it's inequality of opportunity, whether it's on the political reform agenda, whether it's on the environment agenda, I see the Conservatives as the biggest block. Now, that does not then mean that I agree with the Labour Party. I can only look at what they are doing at any one time. My job is to make the Liberal Democrats as successful as we possibly can be, and that is my focus. You know, we've seen, however, some quite logical behaviour from both parties at recent by-elections. So, you know, there were some by-elections which we judged we couldn't really win because we were too far behind, so we didn't spend a lot of money on them, and the Labour Party likewise. And when I look at the next election, it's nothing to do with pacts or deals or any of that sort of stuff, far from it. What it's to do with is rational behaviour. So the seats that we hold, the Conservatives are in second place in 9 of them, and SNP in 4 of them. And the seats we're most likely to win, there's only one I can think of where Labour currently holds it, and one where the SNP hold it. The rest are Conservatives. So, you know, in terms of my electoral strategy, it's the Conservatives I have in my sightline.
And is that the soft Conservatives, the ones who perhaps have, you know, maybe feel they've been sacrificed for the red wall?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, obviously, if I could persuade any Conservative to come over, I'll persuade them. But there's no doubt that in what I call the blue wall seats, after we won Cheshire and Amersham, in, you know, not just in southern England and London, but seats where, you know, you've got well-educated. You read Gabriel Barton Singer's chapter, really good on in the book on it, looking at the blue wall seats. Those types of demographers, I think, are where we have a real opportunity. And it stands to reason that in those seats, you've got to win over votes of people who previously voted Conservative. And what we saw in Cheshire and Amersham, what we saw in North Shropshire, what we've seen in a lot of local elections, is we're increasingly able to do that, winning votes that Labour would never be able to win. I mean, Labour's biggest help, if I'm honest, for us, is they've got rid of Jeremy Corbyn and they've got Keir Starmer in. And I think people are less afraid and worried about Keir Starmer than they were of Jeremy Corbyn. So that has assisted us. But we're only going to win them through our own effort and hard graft and getting ideas that appeal to those people. So a lot of the focus on education is about talking to people, not just about social justice, but also about aspiration. I think empowering parents and giving more power to parents is something that some lifelong Conservatives will respond to, because they feel disempowered and taken for granted by the Conservatives. The carer agenda, which you've not talked about, something I'm passionate about. I've been a carer most of my life. I feel carers have been completely taken for granted by the Conservatives. And if we're going to offer them a fair deal, so a new sort of contract, and show that we're going to give them power too, there's a lot we can do in that agenda. And the carers go across the political spectrum. And there's quite a lot in the book too, a lot of what I've been saying about small business and the self-employed, and giving the self-employed a better deal is something that I think will resonate with those liberal Tories, if you like, those people who actually share a lot of our values, always have, but haven't necessarily looked at us as closely as I think they will at the next election.
You're absolutely right, Ed. We haven't touched on health and social care. We haven't touched on policing. There are many, many things that we have not had the chance to discuss in this, mainly on account of the fact that people have been so busy in sending through their ideas. But this is actually what Radic's Big Tent is about. It's a platform for independent and constructive political discussion, innovative entrepreneurial ideas and collaborative action. And as I'm sure everybody knows, we're an independent, non-aligned charity setting the agenda for regenerating our society and our economy. And I'm assuming and hoping, Ed, that we can continue this conversation in Bristol, because I believe you're one of the speakers at Transitions, which is the 10th and 11th of June. If that's wrong, somebody will correct me. But as we come to the end of this fascinating hour, I want you really to just think about, what is your philosophy? What is the Ed Davey philosophy that underpins the reason why you're a Liberal Democrat? what you think runs through The Battle for Liberal Britain, the book that you've edited that we've been talking about today, and where you see the party, if you like, in a very different climate.
Well, I've always been frustrated when I'm asked that question, that people don't understand that liberalism is the richest political philosophy out there. We're the only party that has a rich, long-held philosophy. The challenge is updating that and making it relevant to people. You start, though, with the core of what I consider to be the core of liberalism, at least, and that's about power and how you manage power. And there are two aspects of that: giving power to people, whether it's devolving power, whether it's giving them power as a parent, as a carer, as a self-employed person, and mirror image, holding the already powerful to account. This is sort of anti-establishment bit, reformist bit, where you say to a government, a large corporation, a union, a fossil fuel company, big finance, we're going to hold you to account for the individual citizen. So that approach to power, I think, is fundamental to liberalism, and actually speaks a lot of the issues in our world today. And when we're sort of translating that philosophy into the next election and campaigning, for me, it's about saying to people, look, many of you, you work hard, you get your kids to school, you do all the right thing, and the government's not delivering its side of the bargain. There's no reciprocity from the government. And I think people felt they used to be. And so in the book, we do talk about a social contract. We're revisiting that social contract between the citizen and the state to make sure that the state is doing its bit far better. And I guess in common parlance, we talk about the fair deal, giving people a fair deal again in schools, in health service and caring, in housing and so on. So, you start with an analysis of power and how power works. And liberals always have been about controlling the powerful and stopping the abuse of power and civil liberties and human rights and so on, and moving that into what people are really worried about in their own lives today, where they feel disempowered. They don't feel that they're listened to, that they have the influence and control over their lives that they want. And I like to think this book has a whole set of ideas of how we can change that and give people the fair deal that I think they're after.
Well, a very good plug, available from all good bookshops. And there's a link that we've put up on here. The Battle for Liberal Britain, which is edited by Ed Davey. And the booklet that I mentioned earlier about the experiences of people and how their communities have come together is called Together Again, which you can also find on the website. Ed, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I do hope we will continue this conversation. That is really a hint to Ben to book us both, really, for and thanks so much to everybody who has taken part in this. It's really good. I mean, I think in the last 6 months, and Ben will correct me if I'm wrong, but we've talked about electoral reform, we've talked about levelling up, we've talked about the culture wars, we've talked about Joe Zammit-Lucia's amazing book, which is going to be properly launched in person next week in London. Details of that are on there. We only did the online pre-launch event. The conversations, the involvement and the engagement that you find on a Big Tent Radix event are what most politicians would give their eye teeth to have when they knock on the door and get it slammed in their face. Ed, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm going to hand back to Ben now. Thank you.
Joe, that was fantastic. Ed, thank you very much. Thank you particularly for your last answer, which, other than expressing it more eloquently, is pretty much the same answer that I would have given from my days working for the party. And I hope you might accept my challenge, although you don't need to do it in the next minute, to find a way of expressing exactly the same answer in 10 words or less. Which
give people power, hold the powerful to account.
Very good. Gosh, and that was almost exactly 10, I think. Thank you. That's brilliant. I hope people will take the opportunity to read the book. You'll have seen the link to purchase it appearing in the chat.